hope last night's tale didn't follow you too far into your dreams, but if it did, well, I fear tonight's journey may stretch those mile markers even further into the dark. So, snuggle a little closer to the fire, lean into its warm glow, and come with me down a long, lonely highway where guardrails and ghouls kept uneasy company with those who leaned too close to a stranger and sometimes found themselves screaming in the dark. Because what lingered there among the ditch lilies and ragweed was not the rage of a gunman, nor the frenzy of a madman who kills in sudden bursts of insanity. No, this was slower, colder, calculated. A patience that stalked the blacktop in silence. A shadow drifting along the endless ribbons of road where headlights thinned and the night swallowed whole those who dared trust the wrong hand on the wheel. So, pull that blanket closer to your chin and follow me onto California's I-5 highway, a stretch of asphalt where dreams and dread traveled side by side. It was 1977, and the California sun burned hot by day, but by night, the dark highway whispered of cold secrets only the guardrails and the ghouls would keep.
By all accounts, Roger Kibbe could have been anyone's neighbor. A soft-spoken man with thinning hair, the kind of face you'd forget in a crowd. He blended easily into the backdrop of suburban California. He ran a small business repairing windows, sometimes worked construction jobs, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who never made waves. He was married to a woman who saw in him what most saw, a steady, ordinary man who never raised his voice, never slammed his fists, never seemed to stir trouble. In Elk Grove, a suburb of Sacramento, he lived the kind of life that looked almost painfully average. Kibbe kept his house neat, his yard tidy. He was polite when he spoke to neighbors, never too familiar, never too distant, just the right balance of small-town civility. If you had seen him in the grocery store, you might have thought he looked like a schoolteacher, or perhaps the sort of uncle who slips a dollar bill into a birthday card. But there was something under that calm surface, an itch, a restlessness that had first shown itself years earlier. In the late 1970s, Kibbe's darker urges stirred in ways that even he struggled to keep hidden. He had been arrested before, small charges at first, petty thefts and prowling incidents, little things that barely raised eyebrows in court. But the escalation was there. Behind closed doors, Kibbe fantasized about domination, about binding women, about taking away their breath. And in September of 1977, the facade finally cracked. But only for a moment. Her name was Llewellyn Burleigh. She was just 21, bright, ambitious, hopeful. To her, a job opportunity sounded like the start of something new, the kind of chance every young woman dreams of when stepping into adulthood. Kibbe had lured her with the promise of a position as a secretary at a cosmetic studio on Contra Costa Boulevard. A steady paycheck, the word secretary carrying its own kind of professional dignity in those days. He sounded polite, trustworthy, ordinary. When they met, he explained that his office was under construction, a half-truth that softened the strangeness of what came next. He suggested they meet in his van. A strange place, perhaps, but Llewellyn was polite, and she believed in the possibility of his offer. She stepped inside. It was there that the mask slipped. Kibbe bound her wrists, and what had been framed as opportunity became captivity. He drove her north to Lake Berryessa, the same lake that only years before had been haunted by another infamous killer, the Zodiac. But Kibbe's violence was quieter, less theatrical. By the time the van's tires rolled to a stop near a dry riverbed, Llewellyn's fate was sealed. He raped her, killed her, and left her body to the silence of the wilderness. A dry gash in the earth that would hold his secret tight. And then, just like that, he returned home, back to his wife, to his neighbors, to his tidy yard. To the world, Roger Kibbe remained the same mild man, his monster carefully tucked back away. But that day, he had crossed the threshold from thought to act, and once that line is crossed, it rarely stays behind. For nearly a decade afterward, he lived quietly,
But patience has its own clock, and the long black top of California's highways would soon give him both call and cover.
Highways are strange creatures. By day, they pulse with life, headlights blinking like fireflies, tires humming their endless lullabies. But by night, the long ribbons of asphalt stretch into something else entirely. Out beyond the glow of gas stations and neon-lit diners, the blacktop becomes a hunting ground. It was here, along California's sprawling interstates, that Roger Kibbe shed the last pretense of being just another neighbor. For nearly a decade after the murder of Lou Ellen Burleigh, he had lived quietly. His tidy yard, his polite nods to neighbors, his work as a handyman, all of it a costume. But now, in the mid-1980s, the quiet broke. His hunger sharpened. His patience, that cold and careful patience, led him out to the places where guardrails bent over weeds and shadows swallowed headlights. And he became what police would later call the I-5 Strangler.
It began again with Lora Heedick Heedick. She was 21, struggling, caught between survival and the lure of drugs. At her boyfriend's urging, she had agreed to sell herself, to trade dignity for quick money. So, on April 20th, 1986, she climbed into a car, a white two-door driven by a man who looked older, steady, forgettable. She invited her boyfriend to join, but soon enough he was dropped off outside a motel, the white car drifting away toward Highway 99. Lora promised to return with their needs. She never did. Her body would not be found until September, lying near Sacramento, months of silence pressing down upon her. To investigators, it was already clear whoever had taken her had patience, cruelty, and a way of vanishing into the night without leaving a trace. Weeks later, Barbara Ann Scott, 29, would also cross his path. On July 3, 1986, she was found beneath the trees of a golf course in Antioch, strangled. Her life cut short with the same cold precision that had begun to mark Kibbe's pattern. No frenzy, no chaotic brutality, just a quiet, deliberate end. Barbara's body carried the same signature silence, dumped and left as though the killer trusted the shadows to finish the work of erasure. And indeed, for a time, they did. Then came Stephanie Brown, just 19, barely beginning her life. On July 15, 1986, her body was found in a drainage ditch in San Joaquin County. She had been raped, strangled, and discarded like refuse. But this time, Kibbe left behind something more personal. A pair of unusual scissors glinting in the weeds near her body. To anyone else, they might have seemed like an ordinary tool, but to Kibbe, scissors were sacred. Since his teenage years, he had stolen women's bathing suits and stockings, cutting them into pieces with the same kind of shears. He even tied himself up in women's undergarments, binding his own limbs in the dark. Cutting became ritual, control, a slow dissection of fabric, of identity, of life. And here, in Stephanie's death, the fetish had slipped from his private world and into the crime scene. That autumn, Charmaine Sabra and her mother were stranded on Interstate 5, their car broken down by the side of the road. It was August 17, 1986. A stranger stopped, offering help. Charmaine accepted the ride, perhaps believing in the kindness of passing motorists. But the man who drove away with her was not kind. Months later, on November 9, her body was found near Ione. She had been strangled and discarded, like the others. Oh my. The randomness of it, a car breaking down, a stranger pulling over, showed the chilling reality of Kibbe's hunting ground. Any misstep, any stroke of bad luck, and you might find yourself alone in his van, with your own garments tightening around your neck. Then, on December 21, 1986, the body of Catherine Kelly Quinones, 25, was found near Pope Creek Bridge at Lake Berryessa. She was identified only through fingerprints, at first misnamed as Tracy Lynn Goebel, one of 17 aliases she had used in her life. But the name hardly mattered to Kibbe. She was prey. Another young woman strangled, left beneath the cold winter sky, the lonely bridge holding her final silence. By the end of 1986, the pattern was undeniable. The victims were women, often vulnerable, often alone, often taken from the fringes of society where few would search quickly, strangled, abandoned near lonely stretches of road, and always the whisper of bondage, of scissors, of control.
In June of 1987, Karen Louise Finch, 25, vanished. A week later, her body was found in a ditch in Slough House. She had been sexually assaulted, her throat slashed. Duct tape clung to her hair, remnants of Kibbe's binding. Though prosecutors would never charge him with Finch's death, her fate carried the hallmarks of his ritual. Another life extinguished in silence. Finally, there was Darcie Renée Frackenpohl, just 17, a runaway from Seattle trying to carve out survival in Sacramento. On August 23, 1987, she disappeared. Nearly a month later, on September 19th, her body was discovered in South Lake Tahoe. Strangled, abandoned. Another teenage girl, swallowed by the blacktop and the man who stalked it. By the fall of 1987, law enforcement had bodies piling up across multiple counties. Women of different backgrounds, but the same method, the same hunting ground. The scissors, the bindings, the strangulation, all of it pointed to a predator who did not kill in bursts of madness, but in cold, patient rhythm. Roger Kibbe, the man next door, had become the shadow of the highway. He cruised the dark interstates, headlights flickering in his rear view, scanning the edges of the road for the vulnerable, the desperate, the unlucky. And when he struck, he left no witnesses, only silence, secrets, and another lonely body laid down beyond guardrails. However, highways may hide secrets, but not forever. Beneath the asphalt silence, small things linger, fibers that cling, tape that pulls at strands of hair, a cut in cloth too peculiar to be random. These fragments, almost invisible at first glance, would become the whispers that betrayed the man who thought himself invisible. Every killing carried the stamp of ritual. Roger Kibbe did not simply overpower his victims. He orchestrated their last moments like a grotesque performance. He kidnapped them first, luring them into his vehicle with the promise of help or escape. Then came the parachute rigging cord, strong and unforgiving, the same cord he once used in skydiving, a sport that thrilled him with its blend of precision and danger. To Kibbe, those knots were second nature. With them he bound wrists and ankles, reducing women to trembling captives, silenced further by the sticky pull of duct tape pressed across their mouths. Once they were bound, he turned to the tool that had followed him from childhood into the depths of his darkest fantasies, a pair of scissors that once belonged to his mother. With those blades he cut into the clothing of his victims, but not cleanly, not with the neat lines of tailoring. He sliced irregular shapes, jagged and uneven, as though defacing fabric was an echo of his compulsion to deface life itself. And then, when his control was absolute, he used the cord to garrote his victims, tightening until breath and struggle were gone. Sometimes, before abandoning the body, he cut away their hair, removing it to peel back the duct tape, perhaps another small attempt to erase evidence, or perhaps simply one last violation. The scissors were more than a weapon. They were his private fetish bleeding into reality. As a boy, Kibbe had prowled neighborhoods, stealing bathing suits and stockings from laundry lines, cutting them into pieces in secret. He bound himself in women's underwear, craving the sensation of fabric, restraint, and destruction. In time, fantasy required flesh. The ritual of cutting became a script, first fabric, then life. This private obsession left its mark in the crime scenes. Investigators who examined torn garments could see the patterns,
the strange, irregular cuts, as though clothing itself had been mutilated. It was not only evidence of assault, but evidence of the killer's psyche, a fingerprint more personal than any left by blood or skin. Though Kibbe fancied himself careful, dragging bodies into ditches, leaving them near lonely bridges, or abandoning them beneath golf course trees, he overlooked the truths that highways never truly sleep. Fibers tangle in duct tape. Hair clings tightly to sticky residue even after he tried to cut it away. The parachute cord carried a signature weave, and the scissors, when finally recovered, bore unique edges that matched the peculiar cuts in the victim's clothing. At first, police saw only scattered tragedies. Different counties, different dates, different women. But as the months bled into years, forensic threads began to tie them together. A strangled woman near Sacramento, another near Antioch, another in San Joaquin County. The puzzle grew, and with it the suspicion that one man was wandering the interstates with his private ritual of cords, scissors, and silence. What made him so dangerous was not frenzy, but patience. He was not a maniac screaming in the streets, but a shadow behind the wheel, watching the shoulders of the highway for someone alone, someone desperate. He waited for women stranded at night, for runaways with no home, for those so forgotten by society that their disappearances seemed like accidents. But even patience cannot hide forever. In the odd angle of a scissor cut, in the tight binding of a cord knot, in the hair that clung stubbornly to duct tape, his pattern began to emerge. The I-5 Strangler was leaving more behind than bodies. He was leaving his story in fragments, a trail of trace evidence only science and a bit of time would eventually be able to read. The highways of California stretch wide, and the counties along their veins each carried their own stories of the dead. At first, no one spoke of a pattern. One woman strangled in Sacramento, another in Antioch, another near Lake Berryessa. Different investigators, different desks stacked with paper and photographs, different grieving families. To the untrained eye, these were isolated tragedies scattered across Northern California's map. But by the late 1980s, whispers began to gather. The odd scissor cuts, the parachute cord bindings, the placement of bodies near lonely stretches of highway. They began to speak with one voice. A predator was moving with purpose up and down Interstate 5. Detectives from multiple counties started to meet, comparing notes. Their case files were bruised with the same fingerprints of cruelty, women tied, raped, strangled, their hair crudely cut. The scissors, the duct tape, the cord, trophies of habit that Kibbe could not abandon. Each county had long suspected they were chasing a lone killer. Now the net of cooperation grew tighter. What once felt like coincidence turned to certainty. This was no series of one-off crimes. This was a serial predator with a ritual, and the highways were his hunting ground. The break would not come from the past, but from the moment he slipped in the present. In 1987, Kibbe's calm mask began to crack. He lured Darcie Renée Frackenpohl, a 17-year-old runaway, into his orbit. She was found strangled near South Lake Tahoe, the same signatures carved into her clothing, the same marks left by the cord. But even as that horror unfolded, Kibbe grew careless. Later that same year, he tried to handcuff a young prostitute, Deborah Ann Guffey, in his car. Guffey fought back with every ounce of strength she had, her screams carrying into the night until a nearby officer came running. For once, the predator had chosen the wrong victim. With her testimony, Kibbe was convicted of assault and battery and sent to jail for 8 months. What seemed at first like a minor conviction would become the opening police needed. While Kibbe sat behind bars, investigators pieced together fibers, bindings, and the whispers of unsolved murders. When Guffey later returned to testify about the attempted abduction, it placed a living, breathing survivor on the witness stand. Proof of his methods, proof of his malice, proof that the I-5 Strangler was not a phantom of lonely highways, but a man caught in the act. By this point, the FBI and state task forces had become involved, threading together fibers, fingerprints, and geographic data. Slowly,
the case files formed a shape, a profile of a man who lived quietly in the suburbs, who looked every bit the regular neighbor, but carried scissors in his car, cord in his trunk, and duct tape ready for silence. Kibbe was finally arrested in connection with the 1987 murder of Darcie Frackenpohl. Once inside his home, investigators uncovered the threads of his private life that echoed the crime scenes. Parachute rigging cord, a distinctive pair of scissors, and women's clothing with cuts that matched the jagged slashes on his victims. To neighbors, he had been a handyman, a quiet man with a stutter, someone unremarkable. To police, he had become the embodiment of a nightmare unraveling along I-5. In court, prosecutors laid out the ritual with chilling clarity. The bindings, the scissor mutilations, the calculated strangulation. Each victim's story, once thought to be a lone tragedy, now stood side by side as chapters in a larger narrative of obsession and control. The evidence that had seemed scattered became a portrait of patience and cruelty, a man who stalked by headlights, who turned highways into hunting grounds, and who believed silence and scissors would forever cloak his crimes. But science and persistence had outlasted him. His tools had betrayed him. His fetish had written his name. Across every cut, every cord knot, every piece of duct tape that clung to a strand of hair. The courthouse air in Sacramento was heavy, thick with the anticipation of families who had waited years to hear justice spoken aloud. In the gallery sat mothers, sisters, fathers, each one carrying a grief the highways had delivered and the guardrails could not contain. They weren't there for mystery anymore. They were there to hear the truth laid bare. When Roger Reese Kibbe walked into that courtroom, he looked nothing like the shadow that had haunted California's roads. He looked like the man next door, aging, gray at the temples, hands folded. A stutter, a polite nod, even the awkward air of humility. But prosecutors wasted no time reminding the jury that this was not a kindly neighbor. This was the I-5 Strangler. Piece by piece, the state laid out its evidence. Fibers from parachute rigging cord, found at scenes, matched to Kibbe's possession. The scissors, strange in cut and shape, identical to the irregular slashes carved into the victim's clothing. The duct tape with strands of hair, pulled and brutal in its silence. The pattern of strangulation, precise, consistent, and coldly calculated. The effect was relentless. Each victim's story was resurrected in photographs, reports, and testimony. Jurors saw not just tragedy but a ritual, repeated with the patience of obsession. His lawyers reached back to childhood, painting Kibbe as a boy bullied for his stutter, beaten by his mother, mocked until shame became his closest companion. They spoke of his odd sexual compulsions, his fixation on women's clothing, his self-binding with underwear stolen in adolescence. They called him damaged, a man bent and twisted by forces he could not control, but the jury saw through it. This was not compulsion, erupting in sudden bursts. This was patience, planning, and a predator's control. The scissors were no accident. The cord, no coincidence. The duct tape, no whim. In 1991, the trial ended with Kibbe convicted of first-degree murder in the case of Darcie Frackenpohl. Though long suspected in multiple other killings, prosecutors had focused their arsenal on the case they could prove beyond doubt. The jury, heavy-eyed and shaken, returned the verdict that echoed what families had known in their hearts. The shadow on the highways now had a name. The sentence was clear: 25 years to life in prison. For the gallery, it was both relief and ache. Relief that the man who had haunted their nights was now behind bars. Ache because no gavel could bring their daughters back. No verdict could undo the silence that had followed them home. And for a time, it seemed the story ended there. Kibbe vanished into the system, another convicted man behind stone walls and iron bars. But shadows are rarely still, and though justice had spoken, more voices would rise. Other victims, other cases, until even prison walls could not keep the truth from growing louder. Prison is a slow weather. It doesn't arrive as a storm, it settles like fog. Days file themselves into neat little drawers, count, chow, yard, count again, and a man who once hunted the night learns the geography of beige walls and blue doors. For Roger Kibbe, the highway was gone. In its place, corridors that smelled faintly of disinfectant and dust, the rattle of keys, the low thunder of gates sliding on their tracks. He was older now, his hair greyer, the tidy handyman's calm still lodged in his face like a habit he couldn't shake. To the men who worked the tiers, he was courteous, quiet, a man with the unremarkable manner of someone who'd rather be overlooked. But monsters do not dissolve on contact with concrete. They simply have less room to roam. Years passed like a dull metronome. Out beyond the razor wire, families waited, some for answers, some for a body, some for a word that would let sleep come back to them without a fight. Detectives too kept a different kind of vigil. Evidence drawers were opened, old reports dusted off, new science began to speak a language the past had never learned to fear. DNA. 3 letters that pull ghosts into daylight. Piece by patient piece, cold case teams in Northern California began threading the old fragments together. A knot tied the same peculiar way. Fibers that whispered of ropes, cords, and bindings. Scraps of clothing cut in strange, deliberate arcs. Not the chaos of a panic struggle, but the geometry of a ritual. Kibbe had once been a man of patterns. The highway was a rhythm, the same way a woodshop keeps its rhythm. Measure, mark, cut, sand. Predators who work in patterns rarely notice that patterns can become signatures, and signatures can become shackles. It took time, these things always do, but when the science ripened, interviews resumed. The questions, precise and quiet, pressed at the seams of the story he'd worn for years. And finally the seams began to split. He talked. Not like a penitent, not like a man rushing toward absolution, but like a mechanic explaining the steps of a job he once knew too well. Details surfaced in his breath, mile markers, turn-offs, the kinds of places where the world forgets to look. Fallow fields, service roads, culverts where water whispers all night and tells no one what it knows. He admitted to more, not to a number that felt complete, it never does, but to enough that families could stop pacing the same 4 rooms in their minds. Enough that districts could pin markers to maps and say this one now has a name, even if the name left a worse taste than the silence ever had. In courtrooms and conference rooms the record changed. A man once convicted of a single murder became officially the author of several. Life without the possibility of parole was not altered. No sentence grows heavier than never, but something else did. The ledger between the living and the dead felt, if not balanced, then at least accounted for. Behind bars, Kibbe aged into the soft collapse of routine. There are men who rage against concrete. He was not one of them. He kept to himself, catalogued the hours, learned the tempos of the place. When you spend long enough in a machine designed to erase distinction, you become, even to yourself, a grey shape among other grey shapes. But history has a way of circling back. Justice, or what passes for it, sometimes wears unexpected faces. In 2009, facing the weight of evidence he could no longer deny, Kibbe made his move. To avoid the death penalty, he confessed. He admitted to killing 6 women along Interstate 5. Women whose faces had haunted headlines, whose families had waited decades for answers. His voice was calm, almost clinical, as he recounted the lures, the bindings, the suffocations. The courtroom, once again, became a gallery of grief, as each admission struck like a hammer against the silence. The plea deal spared him execution, but it also branded him, without doubt, as the serial predator the highways had always whispered about. In 2009, the I-5 Strangler was sentenced to 6 additional life terms without parole, stacked upon the first. No possibility of freedom, no chance of slipping back into the daylight, back onto any highway. His story
was done. But in prison, the story of Roger Kibbe was not over. Not yet. The shadow of violence he carried would one day come and find him, even behind the safety of iron bars. It was early in 2021 when Mule Creek State Prison counted its men and came up one too still. Kibbe was found in his cell, lifeless, in the same quiet way he had once left others, not with sirens and headlines, but with the blunt finality of a door closing. His cellmate, a man with violence in his own history, would later say he did what the courts hadn't, and that some debts must be paid twice.
Thanks for listening. This has been Fireside Crime Stories, where the darkest tales are always read by firelight. If you haven't already, subscribe, and before you go, toss a little fuel on the fire. Hit that like button, ring that bell, so when the shadows shift again, you'll be the first to know that another fire's burning and another story's being told. Until next time, stay warm, stay curious, and stay safe.